Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to Test Tube Plus again. This is Trace for our episode 5 of 5 on stereotypes. This has been a crazy week so far, but we're not quite done yet. We've talked about where stereotypes came from, how they're perpetuated through the media, and maybe even by us, and then also whether they can be good for you and why they exist at all. But today we're going to talk about how stereotypes can be dangerous, because you can't talk about stereotypes without talking about their negatives. Stereotypes can be very bad. When we work with only our stereotypes, we're using information that's not real. It's information that only exists in our own minds. As we pointed out before, stereotypes is basically us being kind of shortcutty. We're taking information, we're distilling it, and then we're using similar information to fill in the blanks. Most stereotyping is very bad, and it can lead to some pretty messed up things in wider society if we don't realize that's what we're doing. Everything from the inability to create interpersonal relationships all the way to institutionalized racism can be traced back to this basic need or this basic tendency to stereotype. Stereotyping, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant it is, can lead to prejudice and ultimately discrimination if allowed to go forward unchecked. And as we said before, you can be a bleeding heart liberal or a die-hard in-the-wool conservative and not hold a single conscious bias, but have a bunch of unconscious biases. There's a growing number of studies that show the link between hidden bias or unconscious bias and how that is transferred into outward behavior, how that affects everything that you do. Basically, we're saying your unconscious bias can become your actions. And these unconscious biases can be exacerbated when a person is under duress or in a stressful situation. Do you remember in The Matrix when that guy was all like, to really know someone, you have to fight them? This is sort of the same thing. When you are under stress, your unconscious biases spill out of you because your brain has what's called a cognitive load. And there's a theory called high cognitive load theory, which says that when your brain is stressed and trying to process lots of information, rather than churning through all the data, it's going to take shortcuts. It's going to try and grab for your stereotype files off of the shelf and use those stereotypical responses rather than looking at what's really going on. Unconscious beliefs and attitudes have been found to be associated with language and certain behaviors such as eye contact, blinking rates, and smiles, in that you do those behaviors when you're experiencing or drawing from an unconscious bias. If you can't get comfortable around someone, it could be because of an unconscious bias, a bias you didn't even realize that you have. So how can you expect to create a relationship with that person and then overcome that bias and learn more about that person? And that's ultimately how you break down a stereotype. What happens when that unconscious bias isn't aimed at a single person, but at a group of people? And that's when things get even more complicated because you can't learn about every single one of those people. And instead, you're just going to avoid that whole group and never break down that stereotype. This is where the idea of institutionalized racism, sexism, and even ageism can come into play because we just take a group of people, we stereotype about them, and then we cut them out. Not good. Studies have found that school teachers can be victims of this. They clearly apply prejudices to their students, even unconscious ones, carried by blinking rates, smiles, and eye contact. For example, if I have a prejudice against a student, even an unconscious one, I may not smile at them as often as I do this other student that I don't have an unconscious bias against. Students with different ethnicities or sex actually receive different educations by the same teacher in the same classroom. There are also studies on how doctors can treat patients differently based on cultural factors, prejudices, being less educated, poor, or of certain races. Some findings suggest that physicians make less enthusiastic efforts to save alcoholics, attempted suicide victims, drug addicts, prostitutes, vagrants, other groups as well, like racial groups. A quote from the New England Journal of Medicine reads that there is a subtle form of racial bias on the part of medical providers. The level and extent of this problem are unknown, but it's real and potentially harmful, even though predominantly unintentional. And that's the scary thing about stereotypes. If you don't recognize that they're there and you just let them go, they can do real harm. It goes so deep that studies have shown patients of color will receive different medicines for the same disorder than patients who are white. because of stereotyping, even unconsciously. And that is messed up. The criminal justice system has to come to mind for a lot of people when we talk about stereotypes. We've all heard statistics about policing, about black mistreatment. Oxford journals showed that an all-white jury was 16% more likely to convict a black defendant than a white one, but if that jury had just one black member, they convicted a more consistent variation of races. Again, to break a stereotype, you just need to learn more about the people you're stereotyping against. Whenever you mix groups together, whenever you learn more about the group that you think that you know about, your stereotypes will change and break down. Politically, there are implications here as well. A study by the American Journal of Political Science found that white state legislators were less likely to respond to constituents with stereotypically African American names. And this was true not from one political party, but from both here in the US. So stereotypes are pervasive and they're damaging. They can be helpful shortcuts, and sometimes they can be impossible to escape from, but they're not impossible to overwrite, to change, and to break down. And that simply has to do with being conscious that they exist. Knowing that you have a stereotype is the beginning of the road to overcoming that stereotype. We can consciously subvert our animal brains and actively try to not stereotype. It takes more energy for our brain to do that, but we can do it. Obviously, we're never going to 100% succeed. We can't cut every stereotype out of everything that we ever do. Let me go back to the fork example from earlier. You wouldn't want to have to redefine every fork actively every time you meet one. Whenever we finally meet aliens, Vulcans, we're going to stereotype the crap out of them. Vulcans are all so logical. But if we actively try not to do that, we could have one of the most meaningful relationships in the universe. Spock and Kirk, it was pretty meaningful. And that's the key. Stereotypes are great for taking in lots of information and distilling it into something we can use. But what's better? Looking at the information again and again and again, and breaking down the stereotypes that we thought were correct and finding what's really correct. Because it could be anything. Thanks for watching Test Tube Plus, everybody. Let us know down in the comments what you thought of this week about stereotypes. And if you have any ideas for future series that we could cover, come find me on Twitter if you have suggestions as well. I'm at Trace Dominguez. And thanks for tuning in. If you want to listen to this show instead of watch it here on YouTube, you can go over and find us on iTunes. There's a link in the description. And we post the whole series, all 5 episodes, as one audio podcast every week. And while you're there, toss us a rating. We'd appreciate it. And you can subscribe over there as well. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you next time on Test Tube Plus.